Hello, everyone. It is June 29, 2024 at exactly 8:08 a.m. on the West Coast. My name is Ryan Naraine. I am one of three co-hosts of a brand new podcast called The Three Buddies Problem. Is that what we've settled on?
It sounds terrible when you put it that way. The three buddy problem. It's like I
Okay.
don't know.
Thanks to Dennis Fisher and Julian for the suggestions. We actually had two people suggesting this name. The name of the podcast is The Three Body Problem. And here we are with Costin Raiu from Bucharest, Romania. How are you doing, Costin?
Body number one reporting all is well, except I have COVID. It's not a bad form of COVID, so I'm here on the podcast with you guys. But yeah, the second time for me to get COVID.
Toughing it out, giving the people what they want. Thank you for showing up this morning.
I
Juan
can't
Andres
miss it.
Guerrero-Saade is in Montreal. What time is it there?
It's 11 a.m. It's still Eastern. Just living the recon life right now.
Since the last podcast, you've been on the road at two conferences, I believe. One was in The Hague, in addition to Recon. Want to give us a quick update on what's going on with you?
Sure. So just part of my chronic oversubscription, I had the privilege of speaking at the Hague Threat Intel Exchange, Hague TIX, which is its third year running. It's actually a really great conference. So like a very small venue with a bunch of like Dutch MOD people and researchers and uh, all private talks. So like I think a lot of the cool part of the conference circuit is moving towards these like private venues, and it's nice to be able to go in there and say things as they are, and hopefully get some feedback from folks that can actually make some changes.
Since the last podcast, we ended it, Costin, with congratulating you on your Taekwondo black belt. You want to spend a second and give us a sense of where you are now with your training and what happens next?
Of course. Trying to compete with Juan's going to many different conferences. Here I am trying to earn my black belt, which took about 4 years. I can tell you it wasn't easy. If there's one thing that I learned all these years is that there's no substitute for hard work. I mean, there's no other way. If you want something, you want to achieve something, you need to work hard, sweat a lot. And eventually, the rewards will come, but there's no substitute for hard work.
What's the plan? You're going to be a sensei in the future?
I don't think so. Probably too old for that. But I want to keep learning. Want to visit, the Taekwondo temple, so-called temple in Seoul, in South Korea. If people don't know, actually, Taekwondo has kind of two big branches. There's the International Taekwondo Federation (ITF), which is mostly North Korean kind of owned, and there's
Oh,
there's
yeah,
the
yeah.
World Taekwondo Federation, which is much bigger, and it's based in South Korea. So there's like all sorts of opinions here. Some say that the ITF style Taekwondo is more fierce, and WTF, is more tactical or not as I don't know, real world situations useful. We train in the WTF, the World Taekwondo Federation style. So there's a lot of jokes about those initials, which is perhaps why they changed it to WT instead of WTF. Because there's like a lot of anecdotes. Friends of mine in games, and people were saying WTF, and they're like, yeah, we are from WTF as well. Like, no, like what the hell? So yeah, there you go. So Taekwondo, it's very cool to train at our age, especially. I can recommend it to everyone if you want to stay in shape, exercise, do a bit of sports. Uh, Highly recommend it.
Strong recommend as well, especially for jiu-jitsu as well, for folks who are older and just want to keep alive. Anyway, WTF is a perfect segue into the body of the show for this week. We're going to touch on a bunch of news events and subjects that happened this week. We'll talk a little bit about sanctions and indictments. There's a lot of activity happening around Russian hackers being sanctioned by the European Council. I saw some news around a GRU hacker associated with the Whispergate wiper was also indicted. So there's some activity there we'll talk about. There's some big disinformation, election interference reports around AI and LLMs. I want the guys to weigh in on some of that. And then obviously there was a big story this week about someone criticizing Google Project Zero for burning U.S. counterterrorism operations or um, that kind of stuff. So we'll get into all of it. But I want to lead off, Costin, with the news that the Russian hackers behind Gamaredon, Callisto, or you call it Dancing Salome, was sanctioned by the European Council. This coincides with news out of the U.S. Justice Department about this 22-year-old GRU guy who was behind the wiper attacks was also indicted here in the United States. Like, why are we starting to see this activity now? In addition to the news last week about Kaspersky and some executives as well added to that, why are we seeing what does this upsurge in sanctions activity mean?
Well, both the European Union and the United States, together with their allies, they've been using this cyber diplomacy toolbox, which is available at their disposal for some years, I guess. In a way, naming and shaming, the basis of this strategy. I think it works. You know, of course, that they apply the same techniques on companies like cyber mercenaries, and from what I hear, the effects have been quite devastating for those companies. For let's say the 6 hackers that we're talking about, the ones associated with the Gamma Red, I think 4 of them are Russian nationals, and I think that the others 2 are probably Ukrainian. Well, I think the implications probably they're not very serious in the sense that if they just stay in Russia, it probably doesn't mean a lot. It may be a problem, of course, if they have properties outside Russia or from the point of view of using, I don't know, payment services like bank accounts and so on. So that might make things more difficult. We know that, for instance, in the past, a method to bypass this was just using their family's credit cards. So, like all the sanctioned oligarchs and so on, they were just using credit cards issued to their wives. Until the US and the European Union, they started sanctioning their families as well. So making the things a lot more complicated. I think some were actually indicted for trying to bypass sanctions with, hiring people and then using those people's credit cards. So it's obviously, I think it's quite a nuisance for the people who get sanctioned. And as a technique, if you ask me, um, they are powerful for sure. They're powerful tools in their attempts to discourage. But on the other hand, if this is their job, like, okay, they work for the government or for an intelligence agency there, this is not going to change much. I mean, they'll still be protected. They'll still be able to travel in their own countries. I think it's different from an indictment, maybe not as serious when you're talking about sanctions, but for sure, indictment is a totally different kind of business.
You use the words nuisance and disruption in a real sense. This is just a minor kind of irritant to these guys, right? Juan, like, what is the real world implications of being sanctioned? Let's say one of these individuals being sanctioned.
I mean, I think Costin covered it relatively well. Like, to be fair, it's a huge nuisance to the people involved, but I'm not entirely certain what exactly it is that we're trying to accomplish here, right? Like, this is very much one of those situations where you go, well, we have this hammer, let's treat them all like nails, right? And you just kind of start banging away. As Kostin said, right, if you're working for the government, like there have been points at which the Ukrainian security services have pointed to Gamma Radon, or they call them Armageddon, as like related to FSB Crimea. Like, they're particularly, I think, sour about these guys because it was like kind of like traitors, right? Like they kind of just switched sides after the annexation. But we've discussed this, and I think it kind of becomes a little more approachable when you consider sort of the counterfactual, right? If somebody were sanctioning people who work at Booz Allen, right, for operations that they did for as part of their work in the NSA against some other country, you could um, you could argue, right? Like, how much of this are they doing on their own? How much of this is being top down? What difference does it logistically make other than making their lives a little harder? And frankly, do we really want to put operators for a nation state capability, like actually part of a military or intelligence community organization, as targets to get picked up and be sort of directly indicted and so on? Like, it's a complicated topic in some ways. I think more than anything, it's complicated by virtue of not having a whole lot of tools available to us. So, you go for the sanctions because, well, what else are you going to go for, right? Like, you're not going to drone strike. Well, you might, but like, to what extent do you want to, like, try to interdict people? Do you want to, like, try to black bag them? Do you want to actually try to blow up a place in retaliation? Or do you just go, hey, you can't have a credit card, right? Like, you're like, okay, fine, cool.
I think that the blowing up people or like missile or droning them has always been part of the discussion for some time, right?
Well,
You
we
see
joked
that,
about it a lot, right? I think mostly since that Syria case where, like, one of the Syrian Electronic Army hackers, I think, was that got drone stricken. Um,
and in
but
Israel,
that
I think
was,
as well, right?
well, the Israeli one, I think, it was a building that was supposed to house, like, Gaza cyber operations, but at the same time, I think there's a lot more that goes into the show of that, knowing how they tend to conduct their ops. I'm almost certain they must have called the place and gotten every family and person out of there and then just bombed an empty building. Like, it's for show in some ways.
The federal, the other story we mentioned was this federal grand jury indictment in Maryland about this 22-year-old Amin Timovich Stigal, which is directly, well, not directly, but associated with what you were just saying. In advance of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he
Mhm.
targeted his Ukraine government systems and data with these wiper-type attacks. So,
Right.
I mean, these are things with kinetic implications, and it's not just another piece of malware. So, like, where do is there anything to read into, like, an upsurge in these types of news stories and indictments and sanctions, or this is just par for the course of what we've been seeing?
I don't know. I mean, obviously, there's something to read in seeing the U.S. government decide to make certain moves. Uh, I think we shouldn't get too nutty on trying to figure out exactly what the grand strategy is, because in a lot of these cases, you're seeing effects of activities that were set in motion 9 months ago, right? Like, it only just came down the pipe that these sanctions were finally put through the ringer of, like, the US government bureaucracy. So then sitting there and trying to be like, okay, well, what is the strategic intent of doing these two, three things at the same time?
We're
It
overthinking it.
Yeah,
Way
you're
overthinking it.
definitely way overthinking it. But, sort of speaking to the larger sort of cyber space, right? You just don't have that many options, and I think in many ways, sometimes I question the wisdom of the overt sort of sanction packaging, in particular when it comes to, like, Costin mentioned cyber mercenaries before. Like, I think the whole sanctioning of cyber mercenaries, like, it's particularly Israeli companies, I don't think that had a very good effect. In result, what we ended up seeing was those companies kind of pack up from a country that's, fairly friendly to whatever it is that we need or want, and take all their stuff and go to Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. And now they're doing what they did with a new name, and good luck getting them to change or do anything else, right? To what
But what's
extent
the
was that a
alternative? Leave
valuable
them all
thing?
alone?
No, I don't think the alternative is leave them alone, but you also, I think we're trying to deal with a complex problem through simple solutions. And the complexity of the cyber mercenary, quote unquote, problem really has a lot more to do with who you're selling to and what checks and balances there are on what you do than it has to do with the viability of a corporate structure and its ability to use a financial system. Like, those are not issues. The thornier end of any cyber mercenary issue, and this is something that, like, uh, let's say, uh, surveillance sort of law enforcement malware manufacturers, right? To, like, make it a little more generic, the issue here is, like, most of the time when you're talking about abuses, you're saying you sold to somebody who's a legitimate country, who did a bunch of messed up stuff with what you sold them. And I think the reasonable question from that point forward is, well, why don't you go to this government and accuse them or talk to them about what they did with what they bought. And that's just never really, in the cards. But you're not, that isn't a sanctioning issue. And you're sort of, in some ways, yes, they have some responsibility, but in other ways, you're also just avoiding like a complex diplomatic stalemate by going after the person that sold them the thing they misused.
I
Costin, it
think
sounds like he's pro surveillance tools. Where did this come from
What is
suddenly?
it? You're just putting this
um,
in my mouth at this point, right?
well, one thing, by the way, about this whole discussion with the cyber mercenaries, there's one thing which keeps popping in my mind, which is why do we hear a lot of stories about abuses and how these tools are used in all sorts of malicious ways, but there are no stories or very few stories about, let's say, the good angles of how these tools are used. Like, there's almost no stories whatsoever. Yeah, there were a few on how they were used.
Defend your turf,
I
Juan.
tell you, like, there were a few stories, very few stories of how these tools, I don't know, helped catch a drug dealer or like a drug lord. But there's like almost
But does that mean?
nothing, zero about that.
Let me jump in
It's
right
to
here.
be
Does that mean the
expected.
stories don't exist because we don't hear it?
Right. Right.
It's a
I
good
think that's the
question.
part where no, like look, guys, like let's be honest here. It's in the very nature of the activity that you're not going to hear about the wins. It's the same reason that you can read a book like Legacy of Ashes and it makes it sound like the CIA has never done anything right in its entire fucking existence. It's like, well, you're basing all of this on basically the postmortems of everything that went wrong, and no one's ever declassifying these documents about everything that went right.
Fair,
There's sort of like a confirmation bias to it, right?
But
but
would you, can I ask you a question?
police departments
Would
are
you
never
like,
shy about press conferences with their wins, right?
yeah, and would you
No,
like,
only the
honestly,
FBI. Only the FBI does that shit. Nobody in the intelligence community is calling a press conference to tell you that they figured, like, by definition, right? If you found a way to get one up on people in this sort of like information asymmetrical space, and you got a win out of it, only the FBI thinks it's a good idea to come out and like fucking do book interviews and a press release and everyone pats himself in the back. Anybody else, like obviously the IC is just gonna stay quiet about it. And frankly, like this is something that Lorenzo and I have been like discussing a lot as we talk about sort of the hacking team book, because it's really important to me that we give the company its due as we write this book and sort of discuss the fact that in the beginning there were good intentions and the right customers, and they were enabling activities against, the organized crime in Italy, which is no joke, and they were enabling activities against, for counterterrorism in Spain and other places. There is a legitimate attempt and use case, particularly with these people who were trying to build a market for which there were no rules or guidelines or precedent. In a certain time, this was an interesting, good activity that did have good results. And there are stories that end up coming out of Italy, like, helping to solve like murders and stuff like that in law enforcement. You're like, okay, sure, that's the idea. But I'm sure there's a lot of big wins that we just are never going to hear about. And ultimately, don't look at me like I'm supporting these guys and like quietly into the whole market. I just think that I think that we
I don't
tend
know.
to paint.
You're a book, or you
Dude,
become a book author, and all of a sudden, like the subject of the book becomes
no.
like the victim.
No. What I want to say is there's a problem with the market in the way that it evolved. There's a problem with the fact that it cannot be regulated by definition. There's almost like a game theoretical problem in the fact that you are selling a thing that by design you are not allowed to check, to overlook how it's being used, and then you're being held responsible for the outcomes. So in effect, if that is the case, that market as an open market for multiple nations cannot exist without abuse. And that's really the part that we're not discussing, right? Like we don't talk about Azimuth or some other company that's in a regulated space in law-abiding countries that are selling to law-abiding, organizations within the same legal framework and context in the same way that we talk about Hacking Team or FinFisher or whomever, because you don't have this free-for-all where they suddenly turn around and go sell to Sudan and go, well, good luck, right? Like, let's see what happens. So there's something about the market that's more important to me than the actual, individual organizations.
I see Costin squinting and shaking his head.
Listen, like what the government does with your money, my money, I think we should hear more. I think that there's a lack of success stories, and I have the right. I mean, it's my right. If you're using my money to pay for these tools, then I think we should hear more, and I think it would benefit them if there would be more. I don't know. Case studies of how these tools actually did good. Again, at the moment, it feels like these tools are only used for bad things. They're abused all over the world,
Right.
and there's like any good use is like 1% of that. The rest,
It's a
99%, is all bad.
Right, but what if
one-handed
that usage
handshake,
is
right?
what if that usage is just a subset of a much, much larger investigation? Like you use that access to just kind of pinpoint one small thing within the paleontology, and it's not really the big story. And the important question for you, Costin, is do you accept that these tools belong in the hands of law enforcement?
I think it's a very good question because I tell you something. A couple of months ago, I think I wrote a blog in which I argued that there is there's almost like no legitimate use for these kind of tools, and I'll tell you why. Because they are too expensive for law enforcement. Like I used to have friends working in law enforcement here, and I asked them, "What's your budget for legal surveillance software?" And they said like $2,000. So that was their budget to buy Pegasus or whatever, $2,000. Um, like these kind of things, what do they cost? Like $10 million, $20 million, $40 million. With when you invest those kind of money, you need to use these things on big things. Like you need to use them on big targets, right? And it's like, what's a justification to use that on us to catch a small drug dealer? Spend $10 million to catch like a little guy? No, you're going to use them on big targets, and those big targets will be the kind of targets that help you win re-elections, the kind of targets that will keep you in power, basically, and that's what we are saying.
So you don't see any legitimacy whatsoever to the availability of these tools?
I see a legitimacy, but not for the tools that cost $10 million. I mean, with that kind of a price tag, there's no legitimate
We're
use.
parsing it in ways that I think it's maybe not the best way to look at the problem in a way, right? Like the cost for sure, like Costin, you are correct in that it sort of puts a certain kind of buyer involved in it. I think, frankly, we should be having different conversations about intelligence collection tools being used by law enforcement versus intelligence agencies, right? Like part of the issue with some of this access, and it's something that we used to talk about ages ago, 8 years ago, maybe, is well, there's different remits. If the IC needs to monitor something, gain information from it, that's one thing. If law enforcement is trying to gain that information and at the same time essentially revoking the integrity of systems from which they intend to collect evidence, there's a massively complex discussion there that is definitely not being had. I think you could also discuss the difference between, we should discuss the difference between locally sourced, locally made surveillance tools, right? Your farm to table surveillance versus getting this international sort of people just selling across the board. Uh, for a variety of reasons, but one that I'll mention is at no point have we seen NSO or Hacking Team or Finfish or anybody even seem to care about the legal frameworks of the countries that they're selling to. Like you can't, like, all they say is, well, we're selling to law enforcement or we're selling to a government organization. You go, yeah, but within the legal framework of that country, there is no actual oversight or any kind of legitimacy to surveillance. Like the case that we saw in Turkey, and I'll stop here, but Hacking Team selling to the Turkish police, it looks like they sold A, to an entity that was not the Turkish police, B, it was a bunch of rogue cops, but most importantly, within Turkish law, the police are not supposed to have any wiretapping remit. Only the intelligence community does. So you look at one of these organizations and go, look, you're just like putting on this puppet show in front of us. Like the verification here is absolute horseshit.
Can we segue quickly to the big blog post that's been making the rounds by
Which
Michael
one?
Coppola? No, there's a blog post by Michael Coppola, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Michael. I'll put a link to it in the description. It's titled "Google Stop Burning Counterterrorism Operations," and it fits right into this conversation about like the responsibility of threat intel, security researchers, malware analysts, whatever you call them, the
Right.
responsibility of those organizations to handle data related to operations when there is internal knowledge that it actually belongs to, let's say, a Western counterterrorism operation. There's the argument. This is not a new conversation. We've had this conversation forever. Costin, you and I just discussed it on the Great Exit interview, which triggers the opening question. What is the reason for the timing of this now? Is there something bubbling in the background that's like causing some conflict? Because I know how these things work, and it just feels very
Yeah.
much like there's a reason to kind of trigger this conversation.
I'm sure there's some conversations being had in the VR space and the vulnerability research space that are now making this sort of come back up. And I say that because like you said, it was surprising as sort of the timing, because I went up on stage to personally receive the pony that was supposed to go to Google Tag for having burned those O days at Black Hat like 2 years ago. The
And it was a
conversations were
negative
had.
pony, right?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, it was sort of a slap in the face, and so there's a conversation to be had here. I'd rather not have it entirely on the terms of that blog, because it feels like it kind of felt like somebody was under a rock and sort of woke up and was like, "Oh, can you believe this stuff that happened 2 years ago and 4 years ago and 8 years ago?" Right? Like, there's a discussion there that seems kind of out of place, and it doesn't seem to be evolving in the way that I would expect it for something that the three of us have been either involved in or chatting around for many, many years. But it doesn't take into account a lot of the nuances that we've played out in the malware analysis space, which is, well, it's not Google Tag's job to do CT. Sure,
Or
that's
any other
somebody.
private vendors.
It's no private vendor's job to do counterterrorism. Now, does that mean that we don't give a shit about counterterrorism? I don't think we should. I think that's an overreaction by a lot of. You tend to see it, especially with the European malware analysts, where like they'll lean on the side of basically throwing their hands up and just pretending that it doesn't, like that just
Costin, he's
doesn't
talking
matter at
about you.
all. I'm not talking about you. Like, well, in part, I maybe, but I think in reality, like Ivan, whose last name I cannot pronounce, or like there's other folks who, like, I'll see them
Justice
making that
Rage.
argument. Yeah, I'll see them making that argument, and sort of, I don't mean to belittle their opinions or just oversimplify them, but look, it's what we've always said. Who are we supposed to be protecting? In what capacity are we supposed to be protecting folks? To what extent? And then also, there's a difference between publishing about an exploit and publishing about an implant. There's a difference between publishing about active infrastructure and not. There's a difference with coordination. If I'm honest here, I think what we're hearing is that people are very upset that Google, probably Shane at the time and the folks at Tag, didn't sit down with the IC the way that most responsible shops do and go, "Hey folks, we just became aware of a series of servers that are used to deploy 0 days. It's our job to protect people against 0 days, so we are going to proceed to patch these 0 days. Please make the relevant organizations aware. Let us know if there's some life and death problem that will happen in the next 3 weeks, and everybody go home." Nobody loves that meeting, but the one thing they like less than that is not having the meeting. I
You're
think.
making a lot of
Can
assumptions
I
there, though.
interrupt you for just a
Sure.
Yes,
moment and
please.
say,
Yeah.
why isn't the IC community sitting with Google and saying, after using a 0 day for 6 months, saying like, "Hey Google, we are using this 0 day in Chrome. Here it is. Can you please fix it?" And so that everyone is more secure, and we'll be using another one. But why aren't they sitting with Google and doing
It's a
that?
good question, Juan, because I noticed you mentioned, you used the word responsible. You said a
Right.
responsible vendor would go to the IC and say this. Like, why is that a
Right.
vendor's responsibility? You're losing me a little bit there.
It's a responsibility on both sides. It's a responsibility. Like I said, the vendor's responsibility, the same way that I take it as my responsibility as as a threat intel producer in certain capacity,
No, you said a
um,
responsible vendor would. You're saying that a
which I,
vendor
I
that
consider
doesn't is
myself
not
one.
responsible?
I consider I think it would be very hard to justify the need for gotcha 0 day burning. You can
None of this is
justify
gotcha
or
either, though, right? But by the time Google Project Zero published this in the Wild series, that shit was way musty, old bugs, and the campaign was not fresh and live and active.
so look, I'm not saying that Coppola or any of the people that were complaining about this are necessarily having the most mature version of this conversation. And at the same time, I really would prefer we kind of variegate the cases that we're dealing with, because we've had to do it with malware platforms. And I think malware platforms are a much bigger deal in a sense, because it's a much larger investment, and you don't just plug in a new 0-day that you bought off the market and keep rolling. You have a much larger retooling issue, which is why I think the malware analysis space has had to have this conversation on more mature terms than the vuln research side, if you ask me. At the same time, you said you're making a lot of assumptions. I'm not making a lot of assumptions here. I'm channeling the rument that I've seen people angry about. And this all starts with Offensive Con, I want to say 4 or 3 years ago, where Shane Huntley had an unfortunate talk from the perspective of Tag, talking about how to handle these 0-days. And apparently the vuln research space kind of got up in arms at that time because of this operation. So you're watching this sort of behind the scenes stuff that's happening between these two groups, neither of which I think is thinking about this on the clearest of terms.
I think it's an important conversation to be had, and what I think is maybe the issue here is that the blog post doesn't actually help with that conversation. So the way I think it was written, also the fact that the author is an exploit developer, so it's essentially written from the point of view of someone who is directly affected by essentially trying to make you all more secure. It's like, the wolf is crying that the sheep have built better defenses against the wolf. So that's how it sounds to me.
All right. Hey, look,
But I
Project
think
Zero
there's
is. Sorry, Costin, go ahead. Sorry.
no, what I mean is that, first of all, that Google blog, I think it's very important to say that it was very different from all the other blogs that Google was pushing. So, first of all, it had no IOCs. You could go through and read everything, and I did that. I went through all the screenshots, all the discussions. There was essentially nothing you can use to write the Yara rule. There was nothing you could use to actually try to detect or catch the samples or the exploits that were being burn, quotes burn. So that was like very, very different from what Google actually publishes regularly, which includes IOCs, network indicators, hashes, Yara rules, and so on. So I think they did a very good job at publishing a blog which explained what was going on without burning anything. So they didn't actually burn anything. What they did, they patched vulnerabilities in Chrome. And
That's burning.
let me say something, that patching vulnerabilities in Chrome has probably zero impact on threat actors' ability to run these operations, because they will just replace that exploit with another one. That's like no
Well,
problem.
that's where I think we have some issues. And honestly, Costin, like I think that
Fight.
that particular point is where that particular point is where we can see some self-delusion on the part of the folks at Project Zero, and a lot of us that want to believe we can all live in this sort of kumbaya ecosystem where everybody get to do their counterterrorism, and we get to burn their O-days too, right? Like it doesn't. There's a convenient fiction there, and in part, I think it comes from these irreconcilable statements where we say the world is safer because we've patched these O-days, and the people doing counterterrorism, they can just replace them with another O-day. If that's the case, like, one of those statements has got to be at least partially false, right? Like those two statements cannot coexist. If we're so good and doing so much at like limiting the scope and availability and damage of 0-days, then no, the CT people can't just keep replacing them. If they can just keep replacing them, then no, patching these O-days isn't doing a goddamn thing, right? Like, at some point, somebody is not quite right, and we're sort of trying to delude ourselves into thinking so. And Project Zero's always had a much more mature thinking around this, right? Like they talk about classes of ODAs and like sort of trying to like limit the space of what can be iterated upon in the same type. Totally get it, absolutely fine. But I think in some way the VR space is maybe starting to get to some of the thornier discussions that the malware analysis space had to deal with much earlier on. And in this case, I think the unspoken part is I think the VR people didn't understand why Google suddenly came out with 7 ODAs that applied to the same operation. And they're like, well, surely Google tag must be targeting this Western operation. It's like, no, man, they ran into the same C2 server where you were holding all of these ODAs that you were passing depending on what device was connecting to it. They ran into the server. Go fucking secure your ops boxes and stop getting mad at the people that are responding by doing what they're supposed to do for an entire ecosystem of people.
A
So
couple's
your
argument.
message,
One second,
to the
Costin.
VR is like stop whining, be better.
Quit
Stop
bitching and
whining.
sell some ODAs, right? Like,
But no, is there a certain fairness to the argument that Project Zero and Tag are not necessarily passive observers in these investigations? They actively go probing and poking, actively go setting traps to find these 0 days. You're not, and would you
that's
say
their
that's
job.
just a typical way of how exactly? Would you say that's just a typical way of how all threat research teams work?
Yeah, and that's their fucking job. And frankly, I get the sense that someone made some technological improvement that suddenly started racking up these ODay boxes. And we've been in similar situations before where, someone in the threat hunting team will suddenly figure out that we were misparsing some information or we should have been looking at a certain type of box that we weren't looking at before. And then, oh my God, look at the deluge of great stuff that suddenly falls in. And some people are going to get mad about that. I don't want to oversimplify the situation. There's nothing simple about it. And frankly, no one should be comfortable. I think the real issue here is that we want to be able to do our nice little cushy tech jobs with no moral obligations or ethical quandaries or any kind of, thorny subjects that might keep us up at night. And you just don't get to do that. That's just not the way that works.
Costin, I got a question for you. Do you always know that it's a counterterrorism operation?
Yeah, I think that's another angle in this discussion, and it's something that I suggested a couple of years ago. Is that well, intelligence agencies, whoever, they start tagging their malware and exploits. They put like like with weapons,
Watermark
with
it.
bombs, missiles. They just put there like watermarks, serial numbers, indicators, which allows you like to say what that is and who is behind it and what it is actually used for. So with that, it would be a lot much easier to say for sure what is what.
That's a
Now,
whole other rabbit hole, though. The reality is that the
you
real
would see
question is,
that
do you know?
immediately people on the offensive side, they immediately reject this idea. Like for them, it's like they've seen the devil. Like one way you want to recognize if someone's in the offensive scene,
Suggest
you
that.
mention this idea and just watch them freak out. Like it's immediate effect.
Oh,
Um,
there's another side to
but
this, Costin, like that you've spoken to before, and that I like to remind folks here, which is, I mean, we're only complaining because it's a Western aligned CT op, and I will say we have all in this industry foiled or in some way added friction to counterterrorism operations from a variety of other places and not given a damn about it. Like, if you remember, like, we were just talking about indictment of the GRU. SOFAC, APT28, whatever, since the early days, 2008 and so on, that people were tracking them and it was like a well-kept secret. It wasn't a thing that folks talked about so openly. They were known for doing their ops, and half of their ops or some portion of their ops was counterterrorism in Chechnya and like other areas surrounding Russia. And those were CT ops. Did
You can
anybody give a
argue the
damn?
Chinese. Some of the Chinese folks might argue that some of the Uyghur stuff that you block are counterterrorism operations.
And we know that some of that is incredibly disingenuous at face value, but I am sure that there have been some Chinese CT ops that have gotten muddied along the way. But let's just be completely frank in saying that we don't seem to give a shit quite so much if it's not here. So I bring that up not as a form of like not to point our hypocrisy, but to say that we're not looking at the whole field of study and really discussing what we should be doing with this problem. We only really care about it when it comes home to roost. And I understand, but you also have to remember the lack of granularity on the part of what responders can do. You either patch an O-Day for everybody or you don't. You either block a piece of malware for everybody or you don't. You can't just sit around and there's no tribunal here where we go case by case and say, yes, in this case it'll work, in that case it won't.
So, and based on many discussion that I've had with people from this sphere at conferences, such as Blue Hat, it seems to me there's like several things which are more serious than others, or like things that upset people more. So, for instance, nobody gets upset when, let's say, Apple silently finds a 0-day and patches it, and they just write a line there that, oh yeah, we patched a vulnerability that was
May
potentially
have been exploited.
may have been exploited massively, may have massively been exploited in the wild, and nobody complains. Like everyone's happy. Similarly, like there's some malware, I don't know, and somebody has detection for the malware, like silently, it's fine, no problem. The problems, I think, they really escalate when there's a big blog which describes that whole thingy and burns pretty much all the connections, and then everyone and their cat, they start digging for more in that, and they find more connections, more samples, more operations, and suddenly, like, the entire cluster, the galaxy of everything, it goes down. That's, I think, the issue and what causes the most problems. But just the patching of 0 days or the detection of the malware, I don't think those are like issues that the VR people complain about.
Right. So that's not burning. That's just exposure.
Exposure, yeah, big bang explosion, exposure.
Conspiracy Ryan believes there's something brewing and bubbling. And I guarantee I'll make a prediction that within 6 weeks, Project Zero has a big other blowout series that these guys are trying to get ahead of. That's my little
It's
conspiracy
possible.
Ryan theory.
I
Uh,
I would I would be so happy to see it. Yeah.
Look, man, I am firmly of the belief that behind the scenes, what we're seeing is mismanagement. And there are ways to do all these things without anybody getting quite so pissy about it, at least if they're being adults. And that includes the IC. The intelligence community needs to learn to live with the natural cat and mouse game that comes with people trying to defend themselves. They have a vested interest in people defending themselves as well. They're people too. Um, my guess here is that someone was obstinate and did not sit down and have the big boy talk with these people before they went out and burned a sizable arsenal of things all at once. And I think that's the problem, right? It must feel like you are trying to disable their op when you walk in by surprise and burn 7 0 days for multiple platforms all at once. That must hurt for sure. But it's because you're not giving them the lead up, the heads up, etc., to say, hey, we don't want you to be disrupted from whatever critical stuff it is that you have to do. So just be aware, we found this thing, we're rolling out a patch in 2 weeks. Go get your shit together.
Do you expect us to have this conversation again in a year, Costin? Like I said, we've had these conversations. You guys have made talks about this. We've talked about this on podcasts before. I was quite surprised to see this pop up and become a big topic of conversation, being tweeted and kind of checkmarked by interesting people. So that made conspiracy Ryan. My head started spinning about what will happen next. Is this like, do you expect this to have a chilling effect on others? Maybe not Google Project Zero because they have their own policy, but others may have read this, get into this conversation and say, hey, you know what? Let me not insert myself into national security things and maybe not detect, not publish, not share. Or do you just expect this to just be another talking head thing?
Well, Well, first of all, I wanted to say that it's also interesting to note that most of the comments on this blog post have been negative. I mean, even the people who are known to have developed exploits in the past or selling exploits, they were still quite negative about the blog, and the kind of the one-sided view that the blog is trying to approach. Now, I do think that probably we'll be talking about this more in the future because the issue is not going away. What I think would help is just like with the cyber mercenaries, can we hear more stories about how these things actually help catch
Hire some
whoever?
PR people.
Well,
All we are hearing is that, yeah, like our operations were burned, and the I don't know, someone might be in danger, or this might whatever. But we're like, seriously, well, I let's say that throughout the history we are aware of things, where blowing city operations might have resulted into serious implications. I think the Gauss case is interesting here. We talked about Gauss in the past, Ryan. But essentially, when we published about Gauss, which was probably a city operation targeting the Hezbollah in Lebanon and probably their associates. I think 2 weeks afterwards, there was a terrorist attack on a bus filled with Israeli tourists in Burgas in Bulgaria. And people called it like it was one of the biggest intelligence failures of the Israeli community in decades. And you can't, just but sit and wonder, was this like because they lost visibility because, Gauss was burned? That's a good question. It haunts me. It's still something that I think about. But if you ask me, it would be good to hear more stories, like real world stories where these tools help, and when actually burning these tools have significant implication. I think that is something that is missing from the discussion.
do you think it needs to be an open discussion? Like, is this the kind of thing where, they bring us into a room, they go, hey, boys, like, check this out. This is why you guys are a bunch of assholes, and could you please not? Or
Does
is
that
this the
happen?
kind of...
Hmm.
Yes, it does happen. But I think
Interesting.
more importantly, the discussion here, I think it's broader, and it speaks to a point that I believe Thomas Ridd is covering in his upcoming his next book, which I'm quite excited about. But the problem we're having here is that the IC, particularly in the United States more than anywhere else, perhaps Israel as well, has a terrible time with PR. And for a while, Michael Hayden, God bless the man, seem to be doing the job, whether anybody asked him to or allowed him to or not. For a while, he was out there, before, I believe he had a heart attack or something. Like, before that,
Stroke, yeah.
he had a stroke. Before that, he was everywhere talking about the wins of the IC in whatever capacity he could, talking about how
We're
these things
number
worked in
one.
cyber. Right. Like, but I think that was a really valuable and important role, especially in the post-Snowden era, where, frankly, I think a lot of damage was done by not by the disclosures, but by the hullabaloo that was grown around these disclosures, a lot of times in completely unsubstantiated, massively blown out of proportion fashion. But there was no one on the other side saying, that's patently dumb. That's not how that works. We actually only use that 4 times to do this really important thing. Like, the IC just will not speak up for itself. And it's funny in a very sad way, because it's the problem that the United States has had culturally with intelligence since the OSS. Like, it's very hard for us to think about clandestine things, covert things that are not, as Costin said, right? Why aren't you telling me how you're spending the money I give you? The US has always had a culture where the notion that isn't happening, whatever happens under the table, is deeply uncomfortable. And in many ways, particularly during the Cold War, that's something that's been abused and magnified to make the IC seem like an enemy of the country itself, which only went apeshit after the Snowden disclosure. So I do miss Michael Hayden. I do wish we had somebody else sort of like doing that kind of talking out in public. And I think we are identifying a lot of those problems. Like, where are the success stories? Where are the things that tell me, that make it seem like it's important to the IC that us as citizens or whatever know the value that all the money we pour into it is actually bringing.
I can't believe
And
I'm sitting here listening to Juan suggest improved public-private sector partnerships.
God
Which
damn it.
brings me to a question like this kind of back channel conversations that are happening, that stuff cannot possibly scale though. How do you
Right.
kind of bridge this gap? Is there a bridging of this gap, or is this going to continue to be a friction point between research, IC, counterterrorism operations, good guys, bad guys? Is this going to be a thing that we'll deal with forever?
We're going to keep dealing with it for the time being. It doesn't have to be the way things are, but it's not up to us to educate an entire population or to mitigate everything that's happening around our sector. But more importantly, I wonder what is going to happen to threat intelligence in the next 5 years. So to have a conversation about how much the IC needs to change, they tend to think of themselves as having quite a bit of longevity, even in the US, which is, obviously quite a young intelligence community. I wonder if they're wondering how long we're going to last. Right.
As they should.
Right. So who knows? Who knows what this conversation looks like in 5 years? Because who knows who's involved in the conversation in the first place?
We're running out of
So-
time. Sorry, Costin, you can wrap up that topic.
Just wanted to mention one thing, which kind of supports the idea of having more transparency is good. So recently, the Ukrainian intelligence, they've been a lot more open and transparent about their cyber operations. I think recently they just published that they shut down the traffic on the bridge in Crimea, and that was one of their successful cyber operations. So taking credit for that, and I think they've done this in the past as well. When they were doing offensive cyber operations to Russia, I think they're kind of pioneering here.
Mhm.
The idea that successful offensive cyber operations should be more prominent, should be more visible, and
Yeah.
government should be more transparent about that.
Are you
And so
asking for a
kudos
line
to
in a
Ukraine.
so a drone strike happens in some farm somewhere? You're asking that the press release has a line there about thanks to these old days from Chrome for participating. Like,
No, dude.
No, but it could say like thanks to Michael Coppola for providing us the 0 days that
Come on, you
enabled this.
leave the man alone. He just wrote a blog, a poorly timed blog. No, look, I think that there is something valuable to be said about how much more is being written in the great book of history and how this shit is playing out by the Ukrainians, the Israelis, the Belarusians right now than any bullshit Talon manual or policy nonsense. And none of these fucking papers will amount to anything. But the Israelis and the Ukrainians are doing so much more for our understanding of what offensive operations should be, how they should be conducted, what effects they're going to have, because they're at war. And we can stop fucking hand-wringing about possible, oh my God, a UN map scanned this place, and the MRI machine melted and it killed 4 orphans, and you never NMAP scan anything, right? It's these stupid thought exercises. The truth is, when you watch people at war having to do the things they need to do to survive, you are seeing what operations should look like, and we need to learn from that.
shout out to my boy Dave Vitale, Ian Roos, and a bunch of those guys who were name dropped in the couple of posts. I'll post a link in the description. which actually added a lot of validity to the argument and caused a lot of the conversation. Anyway, let's pivot quickly and close with 2 big stories that also that started this week that I want to touch on and get your guys' thoughts on. TeamViewer actually acknowledged, confirmed that they were compromised by suspected APT29, Nobelium, Midnight Blizzard, regardless of who you call it. Same day that Microsoft also announced that they're alerting more customers that, hey, it's the emails that were stolen from us. That is Midnight Blizzard. People actually stop it.
I'm sorry. I had to go check the date of the link. I'm like, how the fuck are we talking? This happened months ago. What you're telling me that I'm gonna find out now?
Well, actually, people started posting the letter on Reddit saying, hey, I got this thing from Microsoft saying, listen, here's a link to log into a secure portal. You have to authorize someone to come in, and we'll show you which emails of yours were stolen. So a lot of people posted this on Reddit saying, hey, is this real? Is this a phishing attack? So, and that's how Bloomberg got the story, and Microsoft acknowledged that, yes, they have been continuing to notify people of this thing. Right? Which I know you're laughing, but which is the point? The point is TeamViewer saying that their corporate network was hacked by these guys. These guys are supposedly the cream of the crop of APTs. And TeamViewer is downplaying it, saying, no, customer data is affected. None of this is affected. Why is TeamViewer such a big victim and a big target? And why is this a significant story, Costin?
Well, it's important to mention that this is not the first time that TeamViewer is in the news for things like this. They've been in the news, I think, a couple of times. In 2019, Der Spiegel, a German magazine, they published a story about Chinese APT breaching TeamViewer with the WinNTI malware. Well, I think that TeamViewer actually admitted, so they confirmed that the story was true, even if back in 2016, when this happened, there was maybe a separate incident in which TeamViewer completely denied that they were compromised and they just blamed the user passwords. I think overall TeamViewer is such a juicy target because it's installed
It's remote control
in a
software.
lot of places. Just imagine a SolarWinds style supply chain attack against TeamViewer, or just imagine simply the ability to take over these connections. I don't know, plugins, updates, whatever you want for APT29. It will be huge. This is why I think over the years, many different APTs they tried their hands at TeamViewer, and probably I would say TeamViewer needs to step up security. They would probably need to invest more into trying to understand these threats to their network.
Not just TeamViewer, right? Like the elephant in the room that people are not really like. You mentioned sort of a SolarWinds style attack through TeamViewer. Well, same dudes that were in Microsoft. God knows when they're done notifying everybody about the emails, maybe they can also let everybody know what was happening with the source code and just how far APT29 got and what they did. But look, I'll be completely open here and say that as a security vendor with a product that is meant to manage and help people manage entire fleets, if you didn't stop the minute that Microsoft thing dropped and went back to see what's happening in your own house, things are not going to look pretty for you. I bet
you couldn't, though. You couldn't, though. There were no logs.
I don't give a shit about the logs. Like, it's our build environment. We spent 3 weeks combing through our entire build environment, making damn sure that we weren't going to find out about this from somewhere else. Go look in, make sure, to whatever extent you can prove a negative, but say, hey, we rotated our tokens. We're managing our tokens in this way. We know what developers are doing, how it's going into our pipeline for building this, that, and the other product. But that is part of the responsible regency that you take on when you're an MSSP and MDR, and like ask Kaseya and some of these other folks. But it's easy to cast aspersions at Microsoft because they're ginormous and they try to downplay everything that happens to them. But the real pattern that we're seeing here, the very obvious TTP, is APT29 is looking for any way that they can keep pulling off SolarWinds style supply chain attacks. And look, we might give TeamViewer shit, but clearly in some way they got caught. APT29 got caught. And clearly we have not seen effects yet that suggest that there was anything that got pushed downstream. So give them credit for that, at least to that extent. And then look at everybody else and go, what the fuck is happening with these other RMM tools, for example?
But we'll likely hear in 6 weeks that source code was stolen. I mean, this is the... you laugh because that's why you go into
They're waiting on an email from Microsoft. Like,
they're busy signing the pledge. I don't know. What should enterprise defenders do or pay attention to as it relates to TeamViewer? If you have TeamViewer in your organization, in your environment, are you worried? Are you ripping it out? Are you just making sure you're updating? Are you adding some more detection logic? Like,
You should be just as uncomfortable with TeamViewer now as I hope you were before, in the sense that every single remote management tool has been getting heavily abused by ransomware groups for the past year or two anyways. So if you have a complete allowance for any RMM tool to show up in your environment and just do things uncontrolled, the supply chain attack is not, it should not be your first concern. Just somebody abusing these tools, it's going to look relatively the same. So start there, and then we can talk about if you happen to be a shop that only allows TeamViewer because you use TeamViewer to manage your enterprise environment. Now we can talk about monitoring TeamViewer specifically for if it does anything that it's not supposed to do. But this is very much like a waterfall problem. First, deal with your RMM problem. I am dead certain most of the people here listening are in no way protected for the wide, like 40 RMM solutions that are out there that are being abused by ransomware. So like before you go prying TeamViewer out of your environment, what happens if like a Terra shows up? And if you have no solution for that, like you have a bigger problem.
Costin, another big story floating this week was this Polyfill supply chain breach. It seems to me like it kind of fell under the radar. Is it a significant enough story that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think so. And what's important to say here is that there's maybe kind of a difference in the scope of this supply chain attack. So there's one thing if, let's say, software like TeamViewer or SolarWinds gets malware embedded into it. So there's full compromise, total ownage. What we have here is a kind of a different supply chain attack, if you want, in which a domain that was used to host JavaScript was sold to a Chinese company, and the Chinese company, they tried to take advantage of that. They put things which are not very kosher, if you don't mind me saying. Now, the impact of that is still serious in the sense that yes, those scripts can still do stuff like do password phishing, harvesting of information. They can do profiling. They can, of course, deliver exploits. So you get to visit one of these websites and you end up with an exploit being delivered. But again, the impact is not as serious. What is quite big here is the scope of this attack. So we're talking about millions of websites out there that embed these scripts, which actually forced Cloudflare to take the issue in their own hands and start serving the legitimate scripts whenever someone was trying to connect to the malicious stuff. So I think that it's not a kind of an isolated problem. This is what we're seeing here is the tip of the iceberg, because this is a pretty big issue. There's a lot of repositories out there being used and intermixed and forked, and the regular website, I don't know, like regular website includes dozens of different scripts from different resources. So this is like the big issue here. The fact that many of these repositories, you don't know who's behind them. We're going back to the XZ backdoor attack that we discussed in the past, that they're being infiltrated, that there are attempts to compromise them and to put backdoors into these open source repositories. I think that we will see more of this style of attacks. Until then, of course, you need to check if you are somehow using this Polyfill scripts before. You need to. The best thing is to just get rid of that code from your website. And I think the national certs will be doing a lot of notifications these days. What I would say, like a conclusion here, is that yeah, it's not as serious as a potential malware embedded in a widely used software, but nevertheless, this can potentially result in other types of attacks. And in the end, just something to keep in mind. We were talking about ransomware groups, TeamViewer hacks, and so on. In the end, like probably in if you want to say something positive, you need to give credit to the APT 29 guys. Here we are talking about all these 0 days being burned. Like these guys, they're doing all this stuff with almost no 0 days at all, or like the kind of 0 days they have, they're not even like real 0 days. They just harvest cookies or
Pulling themselves up by their
credentials.
bootstraps.
They're like, I would say, very skilled, and they're very capable in doing all these things without significant resources, which is quite scary and quite impressive. And if there's like one advice I can give, is just like secure your passwords. Like stop using 123 as your password and all those things. Stop using passwords whatsoever if you can. If you're
Next thing you're
still
going to tell me
using
stop clicking on links.
no, I'm just gonna say like a very simple thing is that if you can stop using password and use a hardware key instead with I don't know, fingerprint authentication, that will be a lot more secure than using passwords to do remote authentication. If your infrastructure, if your model includes you logging in remotely through TeamViewer with a password, then you probably have big problems.
But I mean, that's the more complicated issue with the downstream. But I think what we're seeing when it comes to supply chain attacks is it's a byproduct of the general DevOps immaturity of most companies producing a lot of these tools. Right, like if you actually want to secure against the supply chain, like as a provider, as a vendor that produces these tools, which not all of them are big companies. Like look at when we dealt with 3CX, right? Like you have some tiny shop somewhere that provides some relatively critical capability for 6,000 enterprises. Like the issue that you run into is that DevOps is relatively underdeveloped in most places. And if you don't have a good DevOps pipeline, a CI/CD pipeline, and all that shit, what are you guarding? Right? Like you can't come in and systematically deal with all of the tokens for all the developers. You can't come in and deal with anyone that has access to the Git, that has access to a single Jenkins pipeline that is building your product that is ultimately being delivered. And then you can bolt on verifiability and all these different ways of like taking care of. If that shit doesn't exist, if it's just like 30 dudes in Hungary with they compile the product on their PC and then they put it up on a server. Like there's nothing to protect at that point. Like it's just luck and hoping that the Russians don't make it, right? Like that's where we're at. It's a DevOps problem.
All right, let's leave it right there. Juan, I want to give you the last word. What's the latest with LABScon? The call for papers closed. What happens next? Quick word.
So what happens next? So LABScon at this point, we are still extending or clearing invites for folks that want to join. The tickets are selling surprisingly fast. The CFP is actually we got way more submissions than before. Like we're starting to hit that point of kind of critical mass where sort of the attention in the conference is sort of self-perpetuating, which is an honor. It's great. It also means I'm a little more concerned when it comes to people who want to, if you want to wait for the 11th hour, I cannot promise you that you're going to be able to go. So look, I'd love for everybody, all the great folks in the industry to join us. Now's kind of the time to really jump in. There's room still for some sponsors. There's room for folks who want to get tickets, but there won't be for a long time. So now the work is on us. The onus is on us to go through the CFP, make an amazing agenda for folks. And I hope that probably in the next 2 weeks, we will announce what that looks like. But if you want to attend and you think you can get through the request and invite part of things, please jump on board now or reach out to us. Don't wait, because I'm going to assume in about a month and a half, that will just not be an option.
Awesome. Costin, Raiu, braving a COVID infection to give the people what they want. Thank you very much. Juan Andres, safe travels back. This is a holiday week, but we'll still be recording next weekend as well for episode 3 of the 3-body problem. Take care, guys.
Without me.
Come on.
We'll get a co-host. Don't worry about it.
I'll be in vacation, so I'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
I have an idea for your fill-in already.
Guest.
Do we have a third buddy? A fourth buddy?
We got to find a fourth buddy. Take it easy, guys.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.